Hello, and welcome to uh, talking about books and talking about Bernard Malmud's The Fixer. First of all, this is an outstanding novel which I highly recommend to people who want to understand what it's like to be on the side of people that suffer from racism and an oppressive society, and why it's so important to live in a free society. This is what I would sum it up for as. I don't think it's only about Jews. I don't think it's only about anti-Semitism. So this is a book that I just couldn't put down. First thing, Bernard Malmud, one of the great American writers, one of the great Jewish American writers, who actually, I believe, writes about Jews only as a private example of the topic of racism and oppression. So this takes place in 1911 in Russia, when a Jewish man who works as a fixer is accused of murdering a Russian boy for ritual reasons. This is a great novel, which is very hard to read, but it's really keeps you on your toes, like you don't know what's going to happen next. And what's very typical of Bernard Malmud is that he teaches you history without you feeling it. It's very hard to just open a history book and read. And also, it's very hard for people to relate to things that are not made for them emotionally poignant or relevant. And I believe in these days, racism, unfortunately, is still a very relevant topic. And especially these days concerning the rise of anti-Semitism in America, and just to be aware of where the roots of these ideas come from. So it's very shocking for me to read that in Russia at that time, the view of the Jews, the stereotypes of Jews are just so similar to those of the Nazis of the Germany, Austria, World War II, that started 22 years later with the election of Adolf Hitler. So all these ideas actually already existed. We know it existed in the Middle Ages, but in 1911 in Russia, the people, according to this book, they spoke just like the Nazis, and the Jews were treated in a very similar way. So this man, his name is Yaakov Bok, has decided to leave the shtetl. His wife Reza left him. He can't have children. They can't have children together for some reason. He blames the wife, which is a very acceptable idea. Those days, there was no ability to see why a person is infertile, and the wife runs away from him. He is an orphan. His father is murdered by a drunken Russian soldier for being Jewish, and he's left an orphan at the age of 1. His mother dies as childbirth, and already as a young child he witnesses pogroms, which are the anti-Semitic attacks on Jews, which ended with the murder of Jews just because they're Jews. So the novel opens. I read it out loud. I read a few pages out loud, then I realized it's just too much. So it starts from the brickyard. It opens at the brickyard where he is employed by a very anti-Semitic Russian. He saves this man when he finds him laying in the snow, and this is where the plot takes off. So it starts with him finding this anti-Semite. He has the pin of an anti-Semite group, Russian anti-Semite group, the Black Hundreds, that existed at the time and didn't allow Jews, fought against Jews. and just hated Jews, hated people for being born Jewish. And this book has so many quotes of horrible ways of portraying Jews. So he saves this drunken anti-Semite. He sees that he has the pin, but he's a kind person. And also he's a universalist, which means he has a problem living in the shtetl and being identified as a Jew. He's reading Spinoza, and he defines himself as a free thinker. And he tries to be a free thinker, and therefore he doesn't care about the laws in Russia, which forbid people from living in areas, Jews from living in certain areas. And he gives a false name, and he feels bad about it, but he really wants to progress in society, and he has a hard time making a living. And this wealthy anti-Semite offers him a lot of money to be a supervisor. And this is where everything goes wrong. He's an honest man, and then the people there that are cheating his boss at the brickyard, they resent him because he's very honest, and he insists on doing his job. So this body of 12-year-old Russian boy is found stabbed and without blood. And then there's this claim that the Jews are using the blood for some sort of a ritual killing. There's also a mention of the Jews as conspiring to control the world, take over the world. And he is a logical thinker, and he's saying, wait. Jews don't use blood. Even though he himself is not very religious, his wife wouldn't, if there was a little speck of blood in an egg, she would throw it away. And he knows this, and he doesn't understand how anyone can blame Jews for ritual murders. So there is a line, there are several good lines here, but he's trying to fight with logic, where the anti-Semites, the racism is fueled through a very irrational way of thinking that is clearly incited by the Russian Orthodox Church, which acts as an agent to help the Tsar, because the religious institutions worked to help the Tsar remain in his position by blaming the Jews, by claiming that the Tsar is in his position thanks to God, as they interpret him to be. So the father-in-law, Shmuel, is trying to tell him to stay with God, and he says no. Yaakov, says Shmuel, clasping and unclasping his excitable hands, we're not Jews for nothing. Without God, we can't live. Without the covenant, we would have disappeared out of history. Let that be a lesson to you. Here we all have, he's all we have, but who wants more? And he's very angry. He says he's been tortured and he doesn't believe in God anymore. So Shmuel says, a proud man is deaf and blind. How can he hear God? How can he see him? And actually, given the opportunity to convert to Christianity by a priest, he refuses to do so. So his father-in-law is trying to tell him to stay with religion, but he insists on being a free thinker. He's humiliated, he's tortured in a horrible way, and he's in jail. Everybody speaks against him. His wife comes at one point and gets him to sign a paper that declares him to be the father of a child that she had out of wedlock. So apparently he was the problem, and this gives him strength to continue. He continues with his path of being a free thinker, refusing to give up his Jewish religion, and at the same time refusing to convert and insisting of being a free-thinking Jew, which is something that the Russians don't allow. They don't want to see a free-thinking Jew. And so he refuses to betray his people. At one point he's betrayed by a Jew who claims to want to help him, and then tells the authorities that he's trying to use him for sending letters to the outside world, because he's very innocently trusting this Jew and asking him to deliver letters to his father-in-law, asking for help. And at the end, this man betrays him. Despite his betrayal, he refuses to betray his people. He doesn't want to sign any document that's confessing, knowing that this will have consequences on the Jews. So, one thing I've learned, he says towards the end, he thought, there's no such thing as an unpolitical person, man, especially a Jew. You cannot be one without the other. That's clear enough. You can't sit still and see yourself destroyed. Afterwards, he thought, where there's no fight for it, there's no freedom. What does Spinoza says? If the state acts in ways that are abhorrent to human nature, it's the lesser evil to destroy it. Death to the anti-Semites, long live revolution, long live liberty. So there's a scene where the crowds are looking at him, and he's walking, openly weeping, and walking among the crowds towards finally, after years in prison, having a trial. So the book is it just keeps you on the edge the whole time. It mentions every anti-Semite idea ever, and the fixer is a good name because in a way, a Jew, some claim the destiny of Jews is to repair and fix this world. And so what started as a job, which is on a concrete level, is carried to a metaphorical level, that he has taken upon himself the task of being a fixer and fixing this society that is consumed with anti-Semitism, corruption, and violence. And he refuses to give up his ideals despite being tortured severely in the Russian jail. So it's a very encouraging novel for people to be themselves in a society that wants to mold them into being part of a mechanism that is contrary to ideals. So, despite his logical arguments that Judaism is against spilling blood and all the laws of kashrut, kosher cooking, everything is against spilling blood, he's still accused of ritual killing and using blood to bake matzahs, which doesn't make sense, and yet racism doesn't make sense. That's the whole point. And the whole idea in this book is that despite being tortured, despite being facing people that are trying to convince him to give up his ideals, he continues to try to fix the world, and he's in this prison. And the prison, I think, is a metaphor for what society does to people and the way people are held in a sort of prison by society that doesn't allow people to be free thinkers. And if you're a free thinker, society will punish you for it. And so this fight against anti-Semitism and against this false accusation is really in it's two layers of prison. One is the prison, the real prison he's in, and the other prison is the prison that society places you in when you don't fit in. First, he was in a shtetl where he didn't fit in because he didn't want to be a religious Jew, and he couldn't find work. He was a philosopher. He liked to read, and his work was fixing things. He couldn't make a living. And finally, I think he found his calling, which is to fix society. And the way to fix society goes through a lot of suffering and pain, not unlike the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, who actually, if you once he read the New Testament, he saw that it's very similar to that Jesus Christ was actually living the life of a Jew to a large extent. And just like Jesus was crucified on the cross, he was crucified by the Russians for being a free-thinking Jew. And so what he's saying is really we're always crucified for our ideas when we are fighting against a system of oppression and which fights against freedom. And if you want to be a thinker, a fixer, you have to go through a lot of suffering and pain. And how ironic that those societies in East Europe, or also all the extreme religions in the world, actually go against the very foundation of their ideology, because if there's a God that loves mankind, it shouldn't be possible that people that actually are against are arguing against a dogma should have to pay a price such as torture, prison, persecution. So it's exposing on the one hand the hypocrisy of religion, on the other hand he's exposing the hypocrisy of society. So both religion puts you in a prison, like Spinoza was abused and persecuted by the Jews in his community, so that Russia abused the Jews in their society because they didn't live according to the dogmas of that society, and they did not accept the oppression of the society. Or even if they were just quiet, they tortured them just for being different. And so the prison, there are many layers of prisons. You're like in a cage, inside a cage, inside a cage. He's in the cage of Judaism, and then he's in the cage of the Russian society, who's anti-Semitic, and it's a cage inside a cage inside a cage, sort of like a babushka, if we take the Russian doll metaphor. And I want to just tell you, just in a nutshell, my family, generations of my paternal family, I'm getting emotional, lived in these conditions. They went from Latvia to Ukraine to Russia. They were constantly moving around. They were in the business of being rabbis. And finally, my great-grandfather arrived in what was there called Palestine, the land of Israel, as a boy, after probably having witnessed countless pogroms. And what did he witness here? The violence of the Arab surrounding tribes, which he tried to live in peace with, and succeeded to some extent, I must say. And the British, at first the Turkish, he was imprisoned by the Turkish. The people that were for a few hundred years, the Ottoman Empire ruled here, and then afterwards the British as well. And he was very active in the Jewish underground, founding the Jewish state, and just the constant battles. There's just so many battles, and it all started in Russia. And he was also a fixer. And I do believe I have this in me as well. I really try to fix. This is why I first studied psychology, then I went on to education. And a lot of times I find myself facing a broken system that doesn't see how it's not promoting the very ideas it declares itself to promote, which is the education system is supposed to promote open-mindedness and tolerance and fight racism. And when I found myself having to deal with the worst kind of racism in a religious school, I was feeling very confused why I was alone in this battle. I felt so identified with this man because I didn't have anyone that was not the principal, not the other teachers. Actually, the other teachers were also promoting racism, whether it's against Arabs, whether it's against people that were coming from Africa. And I just didn't understand how anyone from a Jewish belief system could be racist, and how they can ignore the racism in the school. And later on, I also found that everywhere that I worked, if I didn't fit in exactly their little box, I was told to leave, or I left. But there were times I left alone because I couldn't work in a place that violence against children was acceptable. Whether it's racist violence, whether it's physical violence, whether it's verbal violence, I encountered it in countless places, and I was just told that I'm unwanted, not desirable, persona non gratis. And also I had a very hard time with my teaching certificate, feeling, despite my master's degree, my thesis, that I was not wanted. So I identify a lot with Yaakov. If you want to be a fixer, you have to pay a heavy price, and society does punish you for wanting to rattle your cage. As James Baldwin, famous writer, African-American writer, wrote this famous essay about also being in a dungeon, being in a prison. So very, very well recommended. It should be required reading in the Israeli school system, American school system for sure. And Bernard Malmud is a great writer, but sadly not known enough. So please read this book, pass it on to other people, and read what it's like to be, just like the experience of being a Jew in Russia during the Tsar, during the times of Nicholas II, is actually the same experience as many people living in societies where there are stereotypes and racism against them. Peace, light, and love, and have a happy high holiday season. And many blessings to everyone around the world, whatever your faith that you grew up in is, and be open to learning about how people from different societies live, and always have zero tolerance for racism. Peace, light, and love.